Hello, and thank you for joining us for the Voice of the People podcast here on kxnet.com. I'm Nicholas Kwalik. First things first, as you can probably tell, we're not in our normal spot. Had to travel out of town for a couple of days, and as you might expect, sometimes when you travel, things don't always go according to plan. So I'm coming from my home office here in Ohio. But all that withstanding, I thank our guest this week for his patience. And that, of course, is Jason Matthews. Uh, Jason, thanks for being here.
Hey, welcome the opportunity to visit with you.
As if you've watched kxnet.com and our political coverage, Jason has helped us with some of our political analysis. And today we're talking about the recent North Dakota primary results. So first of all, Jason, I guess the simple question to start with is, did you see anything different than we might have expected?
No, I think that the election shook out the way that I think a lot of us thought it would. There were a couple surprises. I'll get to those in a moment, but I think that the biggest takeaway from primary night was that, on the whole, it was a very good night for the Republican establishment. The Republican endorsed, or the Republican legislators, Kelly Armstrong, all of those that come from that Republican establishment beat back challenges from the more activist wings of the party. And I think that that's an interesting takeaway from the election, is that this was a resounding victory for the Republican establishment.
And I should have mentioned also at the outset, Jason is a political science professor at one of our area colleges in North Dakota. So he has a little bit of.
I'd have to tell you, I'm an adjunct. I want to make that
okay.
very
All right. Well, nevertheless, he
Yep.
knows what he's talking about. So, I was basically in charge of covering the congressional side of things, and the endorsed candidate didn't get nearly as many votes as I think either he or anyone else thought they might have been. But were you surprised that Julie Fedorchak jumped out ahead as much as she did right away?
I was really surprised by that, because the public polling, what little we had in this race, had showed that you had Rick Becker sitting at about 35% of the vote or so. Fedorchak was in second. There was some conventional wisdom and speculation that perhaps Kara Mund was going to play a spoiler in that race, and Becker was going to be able to basically divide and conquer. But she won by 16 points. And she got 46% of the vote. Becker got about 30% of the vote. He was actually closer to Kara Mund, who got 20% of the vote. That was a big surprise. And I think the other thing that jumped out at me was how poorly these endorsed candidates from the Republican conventions performed. I'm not just talking at the state level, but also at the district level. Because there were a number of districts where, a district here in Bismarck, where the longtime legislative delegation, they didn't even go to the district convention. They didn't even compete. You had Assistant Republican Senate Leader Jerry Klein, who was not nominated by his convention. And he won a resounding victory in his reelection bid in the primaries. But you had Alec Balazic, who came in second to last. You had, in the congressional race, you had the endorsed candidate for DPI, who came in second to last. And I think that, on the whole, you have to ask a question moving forward: what is the value of party endorsements anymore? We are really in this era now. We've been here since 2012, because in 2012, Congressman, or now Senator, Kevin Cramer, he made the decision, when he was going to run again for the U.S. House, that he was going to bypass the convention. He was going to go straight to the primary. And he ended up facing off against his fellow Public Service Commissioner, Brian Kalk, who had the Republican endorsement, and he won that race. Cramer won that one by about 10 points and went on to win the general election, and was in Congress, in the House, for 6 years until he was elected to the Senate in 2018. And since then, you've seen this trend where candidates on the Republican side are saying, we're not going to go to the convention. We're just going to go to the primary. And of course, the most famous and most successful example of all was Doug Burgum in 2016. And that was the playbook that he took. I mean, he did contest at the convention, but he made it very clear in that race against Wayne Stenjum that he was not expecting to prevail at the 2016 state party convention. He would go to the primary, and he took that path, and it yielded positive dividends for him. That was a path that Tammy Miller also decided to take.
But at the same time, we know how much Julie Fedorchak of the vote she got at the convention, and had she not call it quits, let's say, and not, I'm sure there are some people who thought, if she hung in there, she could have gotten on top. But then again, she said she was just not gonna, wait around for another vote, and said, let's go a different direction here, and go to the primary, and it worked out in her favor.
Yeah, it did.
So now you mentioned the most recognizable name as far as North Dakota politics goes right now, and that's outgoing Governor Doug Burgum. How much of a presence do you think he had on this primary?
It's hard to say. I think that Governor Burgum, on the whole, throughout his gubernatorial tenure, has really been somewhat of an outsider in the Republican Party. He did not come up through the ranks of the Republican establishment. He has had sometimes a hot and cold relationship with the legislature. That's been very evident, and I think that shows in a few different ways. But I think that was also perhaps a factor going against Tammy Miller. Perhaps that's not to argue that one way or the other in terms of what he's accomplished in his policies. That's just an observation on how he came into the job of being governor. What was striking to me was the Miller campaign took the Burgum playbook from 2016 and applied it, and it didn't work. And why it didn't work, and I've thought of this, is and have tried to analyze this. What I think the mistake was for Miller was at the end of the day, one size does not fit all. And what really stood out to me, particularly at the end of the campaign, was I think her campaign messaging was backwards. She ended positively. She ended with those testimonials from people who knew her and worked with her and talked about her very successful business career. Those ads, in my opinion, should have ran at the beginning of the campaign to introduce her to the voters. Instead, she came out of the gate very strong, almost as though she was checking all the boxes in delivering essentially the red meat that the base would want in a campaign. And I don't think it worked. And another reason why I don't think, or it obviously didn't work, but another reason I think that it failed to help her is that you cannot discount the power of familiarity and likability. And she was not familiar to voters. She did not get elected to lieutenant governor. She was appointed a couple of years ago. And Kelly Armstrong's been on the ballot for a few cycles now. And Kelly Armstrong is a likable person. Kelly Armstrong is a very sharp person. Kelly Armstrong knows a lot of people across the state. And I'll just share this as an observation and an anecdote. We're a small state, North Dakota, as we all know, but I think in many respects, we're a really large, small community. And every year, thousands of North Dakotans go out to Washington, D.C. As part of groups or advocating one way or the other for causes. And invariably, they go up to Capitol Hill to spend some time with the congressional delegation. But almost 9 times out of 10, you end up meeting with a Senate staffer because, Senator Hoeven has commitments or Senator Kramer has commitments. What's very striking is you hear so many North Dakotans come back and say, I was in Washington, met with the Senate staffer for both the senators, but Congressman Armstrong met with us, even if it was just a drop in for a few minutes. That leaves an impression. And a lot of people don't refer to Congressman Armstrong as Congressman Armstrong. They refer to him as Kelly. And that, I think, at the end of the day, cannot be overstated in terms of the importance when you're going into a campaign. The other thing that I think that Miller tried to do unsuccessfully was she tried to go after Armstrong using some of the same tactics and language that Burgum went after Stenjum in 2016. And again, different times, different contexts, different circumstances. Those were blows that just didn't land. And at the end of the day, I thought there were, somebody like the lieutenant governor who has a lot of positive attributes, a lot of positive qualities, a very successful businesswoman. She was just unable to connect.
And you transitioned very well, as a lot of my guests tend to do here on this podcast, because uh, when I was covering the presidential election back in 2016 and afterwards, the strategy was, when Donald Trump was running, it was first bring in Donald Trump Jr. and then bring in the big guns. Well, Lieutenant Governor Miller tried to bring in the big gun and didn't work.
Mm-hmm. No, it's what was really striking to me in all of these races, Nicholas, for governor and for Congress, is how the ads were and the messaging was absolutely devoid of all policy. All right. Yes, they had debates. Those debates at the end of the day are not well viewed or listened to. We know that in a primary cycle. We only had 20% voter turnout in this primary, which is not unusual, but nevertheless, it's a far cry from what we have in general election campaigns. And when you got into the governor's race, for example, there wasn't much difference in terms of policy what you heard from Armstrong and Miller. There were some differences, but they're basically on the margins. Where voters really get information or are able to share, shape impressions of candidates are through these ads, both online and on the air. And what was striking to me is there was not an ad that I can remember in either the gubernatorial race or in the congressional race that touched on the farm bill, that touched on water, that touched on education or property taxes or housing or highways. It was all either negative in attacking the other candidate, or it was, I'm running to be Donald Trump's best friend, for lack of another description. And that's what it was. And most of the messaging was all national in scope. So it ratified what we see in studying the political trends in the country, that we really are living in a post-policy environment where policy doesn't matter because of the way in which our politics have shaken out over the last few years. And the other thing too is that old maxim that all politics is local, that's dead. All politics is now national, and it's seen through that national prism.
Mhm. We're coming up here later this August, 50 years since President Nixon resigned. And as you well know, the circumstances surrounding that, namely, he didn't want to put himself and I suspect the country through a impeachment trial. And so he decided to step down. And fast forward to our time, we have the first former president convicted of a felony. So I wonder, and this is maybe getting way deep into the woods for the time we have, but I wonder how have we gotten to this point where, don't want to call it the norm, but people seem to be comfortable with this. Just now, I understand too that a lot of people are going to say these charges and so on were politically motivated, so on and so forth. But he's been impeached twice. He's now a convicted felon. Could be could be challenged, of course. But what do you think that says about where we are as a nation?
We're not in a good spot as a country. And this is bigger than Donald Trump and bigger than, Joe Biden. We're in an era right now where we have rampant political tribalism, where we're motivated out of our grievances rather than our commonalities. It's been coming to this point for a long time. It's a point that we've been here before in the past. I think the difference now are these devices, quite frankly. It's multimedia, and it's now I can get up in the morning, whatever my political persuasion may be, and I can be fed information or disinformation, however you want to describe it. All right, but I can be fed the information that's going to confirm my bias, and at no point be exposed to views other than what reinforce my own. And as a result of that, you get into a situation where you become tribal and you see everything through that prism of us versus them. That's not a I'm not bashing the media by any means. That's where we're at. We're also at the point right now where we've decreased the amount of social capital that we're invested in society. We're no longer a society of joiners. We're that, the Rotary clubs, the Kiwanis clubs, the PTOs, those organizations, the veterans groups, those were essential to creating the bedrock of democracy, because it was in that process that you had to come to consensus. It was in that process where you practiced democracy. We're now very much a nation of loners in some respects. We have fewer friends, sociologists will tell you, than we did 20 years ago. We are on our screens all the time. We don't engage in conversations. We don't have the level of debate. We don't even teach debate like we used to, and argumentation, and all of that in the school system like we did years ago. And so it's really been a perfect storm. I taught a class on Watergate because I absolutely am fascinated by the Watergate period. That era was an era in which you only had a handful of sources of information, news. I'm talking to the choir here because you're a journalist, but the idea today that you would say the most trusted person in America would be an anchor person is just it's like, well, what planet are you from? But in this era, in the 1970s, Walter Cronkite was seen as the most trusted man in America. Now, Walter Cronkite had opinions. He had political views. Every anchor person, every journalist has political views.
Yes.
But it was Walter Cronkite's job. It was David Brinkley's job. It was John Chancellor's job to go ahead and report the news. And so you were all getting the news from the same sources. And there was a very clear distinction of what was said on the editorial page versus what was on the front page and what was said in the broadcast. That no longer exists. John Dean, a key Watergate figure, made an astute observation who said Richard Nixon would have survived Watergate if there had been a Fox News or a Newsmax. John Dean's words, not mine, because it was just that ability to play into grievance. The other side does this. But there is something I want to share with you. I think that this is something that we have to remind ourselves as Americans. I think it's one of the most beautiful moments in American political history, at a point of real, national trauma, but also personal tragedy, was that the Democratic congressional leaders knew that impeachment was now a foregone conclusion. But they knew that somebody had to go to Nixon to tell Nixon it was time to go. And there were conversations between the Senate Majority Leader at that time, Mike Mansfield, a Democrat out of Montana, and Republican Senate Minority Leader Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania. And Mansfield and Scott were friends, socialized together. Their wives were friends. It was a different era in Washington. And Mansfield would tell Scott, "Are you ready yet?" "Not yet." "Where are we this week?" "Not yet." And finally, when the smoking gun came out, Scott comes to Mansfield and says, "We're ready." And they go down. Scott, along with the Republican House Leader, John Rhodes, Senator Barry Goldwater, who had been the Republican presidential nominee in '64, they go down to the White House. And as they're going down to the White House to tell the president the votes aren't there, not only will he be impeached, but he will likely, to foregone conclusion, be convicted in the Senate. Mansfield then has his staff fan out on Capitol Hill. They're going to Senate Democratic senators. They're going to Democratic senators, and they're saying no gloating, no statements. This is a tragedy for the nation, and we have to think of Richard Nixon, and we have to think of Pat and their daughters. There was no gloating. There was no spiking the football. It is something that we Americans don't appreciate. The system really did work back then. because it was just a different era.
All right. Well, and not to change the subject, but the country can also get behind one president. I mean, all anybody has to do is get on the internet and do a search for Ronald Reagan Electoral College presidential maps, and I think it's 84 still holds the record for the most.
84, yes.
Yeah, except Minnesota and DC,
Hmm.
Ronald Reagan got, and Walter Mondale wound up with his home state and the nation's capital. So
Yep.
it's just very interesting. I'm sure we and so many of our viewers can appreciate how things can change and stay the same, and just amazing how this country goes. Um, so we, I'm almost tempted not to say it, but do you expect things to turn out like a lot of people are as far as the races that we think, namely the governor and our congressional vote come November?
Yeah, I do. I do. We're a one-party state now. We've sorted ourselves out nationally into blue states and red states. There's very little ticket splitting that takes place anymore. There are various reasons for that, explanations about what happened here at the state
Sure.
level here in North Dakota, and we can get into that if you want to.
Well, I was gonna say we're coming down to it, so I guess one of my final quick questions
Yeah,
would be, what what would it take, or what would the process be like to get the state to turn more purple and maybe closer to blue as far as a Democratic candidate leading into the future?
the national temperature has to change. The
Mhm.
national dynamic has to change. It's really as simple as that. All politics is national. And it's not going to happen in the near future. I think it's going to be more likely 15, 20 years down the road. The Democrats, for their part, the Republicans have never been stronger than they are right now in North Dakota in anybody's lifetime. That is also going to present a set of challenges in the next legislative session because the Democrats have so few seats in the legislature, and they may pick up a seat here or there, but they're not going to be in a position to really shape policy. Where the Republican dynamics are going to be, there's going to be infighting amongst Republicans, and it's going to be fascinating to see what a Governor Armstrong would do with that. I will say this though, in terms of the Democrats, Merrill Pepcorn, the Democratic nominee, is running a different type of campaign than what we've seen in recent years from Democratic gubernatorial candidates. Certainly since the last two cycles, he's out there. He's a pretty effective communicator. He knows a lot of people in the state. He's visible. Those are the types of things that the Democrats need to do in terms of building up their party. But in terms of the dynamics overall, it's hard for me to see a change in this current national environment.
Well, yeah, I think we'll have to see. I guess the next big thing we're going to weigh on is what's going to happen with President Trump ahead of the national convention for the Republicans. Um, any thoughts on that? What we may see, or
It every
are we
time,
are
every
we just going too far afield here? You think?
no, no, absolutely not. I mean, I'm getting tired of the term unprecedented and uncharted waters, but that's where we're at, and that's where we've been. That's where we have been for some years now. He has his sentencing's coming up right before the convention. By that time, we'll also hear from the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, as to the presidential immunity ruling. Does
Sure.
that, depending on how that ruling comes down, does that mean he's going to go up on trial before the November election? I think that's a long shot in the January 6th case. It's impossible to look that far into the future in this
Right.
campaign, other than to say with a high degree of confidence, this is a jump ball election, just like every election since 2000 has been a jump ball election. That's just where we are as a country right now. This is a presidential campaign that's going to be won on the margins. Every little change amongst the voters in just small groups of voters is going to make the difference. I also think it also I tell people this, I tell my students this, I've spoken to other groups about this. I don't trust the polling anymore, to be quite honest about it. One of the things that you're hearing from pollsters is the lack of people who are responding to calls. They can't get enough, so they're having to take, extend their polling dates,
Hmm.
trying to come up with new formulas because, again, people don't answer random phone calls like they once did. And there's something else that we're seeing too, and I'm not a pollster, but I've heard this from others, where are you getting the partisans when they see that there's a number from out of state or an unfamiliar number? Oh, I'm going to take that because that's a poll,
Hmm.
and they want their voices heard. So is that skewing the poll? Pollsters are struggling. I mean, just as I alluded to earlier, in the congressional race, those numbers were off. Those numbers that we were privy to were off. Fedorchak won 16 by 16 points. Just recently in the Maryland Senate primary, you had the eventual victor, Angela Alsobrooks. She was down in one poll by 7. Another poll she was down by 3. The Monday before the election, she ended up winning by 13, 14 points.
Hmm.
So you live by the poll, you're going to die by the poll, and I think that it's just going to be a situation where you're just going to see changes on the margins that'll make a big difference.
Well, we certainly have covered a lot of territory, both locally and nationally, as we're talking about the primary results and what we might expect to come July and then moving into November. So, adjunct Professor Jason Matthews, I can't thank you enough for your time. Uh, we should let people know that you were kind enough to take this on Father's Day. So, a happy Father's Day to you. And
Thank you.
yes, and of course, happy Father's Day to all our viewers. And thanks again, Professor. And thank you for watching the Voice of the People podcast here on KXNet.com. We'll be back soon with more on the questions and answers affecting you soon, because remember, it's your voice that matters, the voice of the people.